Hey, welcome back. In this part of the series, we are going to discover another ES6 feature, which is the default function parameters. Like PHP in Python, functions in JavaScript can have optional parameters. That means we can call a function without specifying the optional arguments because they are set by default. So, prior to ES6, this was one way to create default parameters in a function. The option 1 and option 2 variables here are going to be filled with values if we pass arguments to the function. If not, they will have the no value string instead. So, if we test this out calling the function with 3 arguments, as you see we get the values printed. Now, on the other hand, if we try to skip the third argument, which is supposed to be optional, we get the no value string printed instead. Although this approach proves to be working, it has one downside which we'll see when we call the function with 0 as an argument. As you can see, even if we passed a third argument to the function, we still get the string no value, because 0 in JavaScript is actually equal to undefined, which in its turn is equal to false. A workaround we can make is to verify the equality of the value in its type using the triple equals sign instead of comparing the values only. Now, even if this solution works, it still requires a bit too much of code for a simple operation, don't you think so? Well, at least that's what the ECMAScript engineers thought before creating a simpler and a cleaner way to achieve the same thing. That being said, this is the ES6 way of creating default function parameters. As you can see, we just need to supply the parameters with initializations that will be used by default in case there wasn't any arguments passed to the function the time it gets called. Sometimes we might need to pass a value to the last optional parameter, whereas we want to keep the default value for the parameter that comes before it. Obviously, we can't skip the second argument here and expect the engine to know that the remaining argument is actually the third argument, not the second one. We just need to set undefined for every optional argument we want to skip. The default values are not limited to literals. We can use expressions to make a default parameter's value dependent on the value of another one, for example. Passing only one argument here means that the required argument is equal to 5, the first optional argument is equal to 0, and the second optional argument is equal to 0 multiplied by 2. Calling the function with 5 as first and second arguments means that the required and the first optional arguments are equal to 5, whereas the second optional argument is equal to 5 multiplied by 2. Finally, calling the function with 3 arguments means that we are not using any default values, so the required and the first optional argument are equal to 5, and the second optional argument is equal to 3. That said, there is an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to making this kind of dependencies between parameters, which is the TDZ of the parameters. If you're not familiar with this term, make sure to watch the previous video in which we've talked about block scope variables and their temporal dead zone in ES6. So, back to the default parameters, the TDZ of each parameter starts at the opening parentheses of the function's definition and it ends at the value assignment of the parameter. Using a parameter while it's still in its TDZ will throw an error And here is an example where we try to use the second optional parameter to determine the default value of the first optional parameter. In other words, we are trying to access the default value of the second parameter while it's still in its TDZ. Since we are not using any default value by providing 3 arguments, the function works fine. The same thing happens when we use the default value only for the third parameter. Now, on the other hand, the function throws an error because it couldn't determine the default value of the first optional parameter, since the second optional parameter's value wasn't ready yet as it was still in its TDZ. Again, a default parameter doesn't need to be a primitive value. We can instantiate an object, for example. We can also make a call of an existing function. And finally, we can go even further by declaring an entire function that we can call from the body of the parent function. And this is it for this part. Make sure to subscribe and I will see you in the next one.